Hello and good morning to everybody tuning in for this latest Reuters events webinar on the topic of ESG and transparency in supply chain. Today, we'll be honing in on the sourcing and procurement function specifically. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce each panelist, starting off with Marc. Marc, can you please introduce yourself and your organization, please?
Hey, a very good morning, evening, and I hope for some of you not night. I'm Marc de Schutter. I'm Chief Procurement Officer for Danone North America. As some of you might know, Danone is specialized in dairy, plant-based waters, and baby food.
Perfect. Thanks for joining us today, Marc. Next up, Matt, if you can please do the same.
Yeah, no problem. Matt Priest, President and CEO of the Footwear Distributors and Retailers of America. We're a Washington, D.C. based trade association representing 95% of the footwear industry. We do a lot in the sustainability space, and you can go to FDRA.org to see who our members are and what we do. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us, Matt. And next up, Kevin, can you introduce yourself and your organization, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin Rabinovich, the Global VP of Sustainability here at Mars, sitting about 10 miles away from Matt in Northern Virginia. So Mars is a large privately held food manufacturing business with operations all around the world. And I lead the team that runs our program that we call Healthy Planet, but essentially our environmental program for our business globally.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us, Kevin. And last but not least, Virginia, can you introduce yourself and your organization, please?
Thanks, Nick. I'm Virginia Thompson. I'm a senior product manager with ONESOURCE, which falls under the larger Thomson Reuters corporate umbrella. We develop and bring to market solutions that help corporations manage some of the challenges associated with some of those kind of complex and very regulated industries, such as global trade management and tax, in a way that kind of helps them stay compliant and drive cost savings. Before I joined product management, I worked for a home furnishings retailer and furniture retailer in order managing the trade compliance and logistics functions there.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us today, Virginia. So to kick things off, I'd like to start with Marc. Marc, can you please just kick things off in terms of, from your perspective, what is ESG and why is it so important for supply chain executives to focus on ESG initiatives?
Well, the ESG is within Danone at least fully integrated at all levels. Why? Because the company has a vision which is called One Planet, One Health. That basically means that each one of us, the more than 100,000 employees around the world, are focusing on the ESG part. That is not really new because although today we call it ESG, in 1972, which by the way are celebrating this year the 50th anniversary of that, our former CEO, Antoine Riboud, was talking about what he called the dual project, where he fundamentally said companies can no longer live on their own. They have to take care about not only their employees, but everything around it, including the environment and including people. So for us, it's a fully integrated part of doing business every day for every employee, I would say.
Excellent. And Kevin, just from your perspective, to Marc's points there, what's your perspective on ESG and why do you think it's so important for supply chain executives to focus in on it?
Yeah, so I think in our history we have a story quite similar to Franck Riboud's story, which is Forrest Mars Sr., who was the second generation of the Mars family owners in 1947, wrote a very similar letter saying, the purpose of the company is about creating a mutuality of benefits for all stakeholders, which is sort of a complicated way of saying you can't succeed in a business as a business in an economy or an environment that is not succeeding. You can't win when everyone around you is losing, and all the facets of what that might mean. And that has manifested more recently into what we call the Mars Compass, which is the ask from our owners and our board for what the business should be trying to achieve. And that has some of the financial objectives that one would expect, as well as something called Trusted Partner, which is about our sort of reputation and how the world at large views us. And then what we call positive societal impact, which often aligns, much more strongly with sort of the E and the S of the ESG space. Specific to your question about why procurement is so critical to this is if you're a food business, and actually this is true for most business categories, the vast majority of your impact happens not in your direct operations, your factories, your stores, your offices, whatever it is that your business does. It comes from your supply chain. And particularly in the case of a food business, it's mostly coming from the supply chain upstream of your business. And procurement is the interface between that upstream supply chain and your business. And so if you want to drive changes in that broader supply chain, procurement is the function that needs to be, both hands on the steering wheel, so to speak, to make that happen.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Kevin. We'll be delving deeper into that later on in the conversation. Matt, just from your perspective, how do you see the ESG conversation? Why do you think it's so important for supply chain executives to focus in on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Kevin really teed it up nicely for me to kind of riff off what he said, because if you think about footwear, 99% of shoes sold in the US market are made overseas. And we're going to go to capture that predominantly in just 3 countries, China, Vietnam, and Indonesia. We bring in 2.5 billion pairs of shoes every year into the US. That's over 7 pairs of shoes for every single man, woman, and child in our country every single year. And so if you think about the impact that has on the movement of those goods, on the environment, on the types of goods that we are selling that need an end-of-life strategy to them, ESG is now kind of the way in which our industry is starting to conceptualize a holistic approach to each of these issues, because some of them, as I think we'll find in our conversation, we find ourselves kind of in the wild, wild west right now as it relates to ESG, as it relates to sustainability in particular, and how we source our products and what types of products we're sourcing, and then how our consumer engages with those products at every step of the life cycle of the product. And so if you try to figure out and get your hands around that, and then develop strategies and investments to help meet the needs of both the company itself as well as your consumer, you got to think of ways in how you kind of conceptualize it and then build that strategy. The other thing that's out there, some of us living in the shadow of Washington, D.C., is the regulatory environment. We know the European marketplace is kind of throwing a lot at the wall right now as it relates to the regulatory environment. The U.S. is a step behind in that regard, but at the same time, we do know that regulations will increase as we move throughout the next few years, not decrease, both in the U.S. market and in the European market. And so how are companies best equipped to meet those new regulatory challenges and burdens that are placed upon them, whether it's reporting through the SEC for publicly traded companies here in the U.S., or it's end of life, who manages the product, who owns that product even after it's sold to the consumer in a European city, or it's some of the ways in which we make claims around recycled materials, and then what does the Federal Trade Commission say about that? So there's a lot to consider as it relates to what the regulatory challenge is for our products, and it's not going away.
Definitely a big issue, and we'll be discussing it further in the conversation. Virginia, just from your perspective, honing in on the S and the G parts of ESG, can you unpack the focus on the social and governance aspects?
Yeah, it was interesting to me listening to particularly Kevin and Marc's opening comments about some of that partnership aspect, because it really does talk a little bit about some of the vision of companies in this space, and how the goals and the concept of partnership and visibility and working with the partners in their supply chain have gone back so many years in their companies. And this is something that actually has been in the conversation at the customs level, at the international level, for example, in the World Customs Organization, almost as long as the timelines that you were talking about in things like the safe framework and everything. And so having this concept of working in an open, transparent space globally, and sharing information across customs organization, and sharing information, and being able to have an understanding of tracking your products farther back in your supply chain, which is a big piece of that sharing of information, and being able to understand where goods are coming from is a big piece of that as well. And one of the challenges that I think we'll get into some of the details around today as well.
Definitely. Matt, just coming back to you, can you talk to us specifically about the social and governance aspects of ESG as well?
Yeah, I think that, sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead, Matt.
Is that for me, Matt or Marc? Sorry.
Go on, Matt, go for it, and we'll go to Marc next.
Okay. Yeah. Each of these kind of takes on its own its own, I think, action forcing event, right? So for example, on the social aspect, the footwear industry has long been a leader in helping to drive particularly Western values into markets where we produce footwear. And there's been a lot of ink spilled over the last 30 or 40 years as to global brands' impact on production, on the sourcing, the social aspect of the lives of those who are making our products, and how we're more involved in those lives, and how we're driving better laws, local laws in each of these countries, and having expectations. We've built an entire audit kind of protocol and industry, billions of dollars flow into it every year to track how our workers are paid, and what wages are paid, and do they get all the social constructs and social insurances that we want their factory owners to provide them. And so we have long been focused on those issues, but then what happens is along comes something like the Uyghur forced labor consideration and what's happening in China and the American response to that, which is an example where the US has actually been the leader on forced labor relative to the European market. Usually it's the other way around from a regulatory perspective, but you've seen kind of this very bipartisan approach to our relationship with China here in the US Congress. And so with that, there's been this expectation from policymakers, whether they know supply chains or not, that your supply chain and your second and third tier providers. And so what are we doing as an industry to help drive on the social side of this thing, a better line of sight, so we know we're not sourcing from factories that are utilizing forced labor or having forced labor thrusted upon them? How are we partnering with our factories to build into those audit protocols? How to track forced labor and pick up on it. And we've seen there's just been a lot of conversation around the implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act here in the US, and how seizures will happen at the border and product won't get in if there's suspicion that it was designed or developed or manufactured using forced labor. So that is just one aspect of kind of how the regulatory environment often you could be doing something for 30 or 40 years as an industry, and it still might not be enough when the regulatory hammer falls down. And so I think we're well equipped to kind of drive that line of sight into our supply chain. But it's also really important that we engage with policymakers to talk about how the technology may not always be there, the information may not always be there, and we're doing the best we can. And so there's this fine balance between those things. And so I think that we're in an era where there's no kind of rest for the weary. Companies have to be really strategic and really thoughtful, and really kind of forward-leaning on not just trying to sell product to consumers. That's like the day job, right? But your new day job is making sure you're doing it in a thoughtful way. You know where that product's coming from, and you know kind of the regulatory burden that's cast upon it, whether it's in the environmental aspect of it or the social aspect of it. And so I think that's something that our companies are keen on trying to figure out and navigate in a thoughtful way.
Great points there, Matt. Marc, did you have anything to add to Matt's points there?
Yeah, I think one of the elements that I would like to add is this is a great example that Matt was willing to share when we are looking towards the outside world, and especially Asia and all that. But I think closer to home, we have to be very, very careful. If you look today to the commodity markets, and for instance, for us, the milk market, the extreme volatility that is driven by the financial world is completely unsustainable for farmers. We see the US every year decreasing its farmer community. And so for us, milk is like gold for the gold industry, or oil for the Exxons of the world. So what we have decided to do is in 2011, we started a program which is called the cost plus model, where fundamentally we guarantee farmers margin and make sure that they can keep farming, going what we call farming for generations. We want to stop that the farmer goes out of business, because food is a massive element of security. We all need it as human beings, but I think we also have a social responsibility to make sure that these farmers can stay in business. And so these are one of the projects. I think globally, it's also what Matt said, but I think we also have to look so locally what it could mean, for the community that is living very close to where the demand is.
Great points, Mark, and thanks for that really good example. Virginia, just from your perspective, Matt mentioned this in his answer, but what are some of the ESG gaps that you're seeing in contemporary organizations, and what are the risks presented by those gaps?
Visibility. Visibility is the big one for sure. So Matt mentioned about, knowing how far back in your supply chain, your tiers. That is absolutely gap number one. I think pretty much everybody knows who they're buying stuff from, who the original manufacturer is. And you may know one tier back from that, but do you know 2 tiers back? Do you know 3 tiers back, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tiers back from that? That is really the hard part. And yet that's the expectation, particularly with some of these newer regulations that are coming out. And it's important to understand that while there's a lot of focus on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that's not the first one on the books, at least not here in the United States. It's been against the law to import goods that were made with forced labor since the 1930s in the United States. It's just this is the first one where there is major enforcement around it and where there's this presumption of guilt, where you have to prove yourself innocent. There actually was one earlier one where you had to prove yourself innocent, but it wasn't as widely enforced and it didn't cover as big a region. And so this is the one that is really getting as much attention and, like I said, as widely enforced. And so for importers trying to understand how far back their supply chain goes and who all those parties are, and then be able to prove what the processes are in place and what's going on is extraordinarily difficult, particularly when you get into countries where they may be up there, those parties may be up against regulations, laws in those countries that prevent them from sharing that information with the US importer. That's actually in place in some countries where they're breaking the law if they tell the US importer, if they basically comply with the US obligation to share that information. So they're between a rock and a hard place. And so it's extraordinarily difficult. And so what's the risk? Well, obviously the risk is enormous. The risk is loss of the goods. That's probably the lowest risk, frankly, that your goods are confiscated and you can't import the goods. The risk to your brand is probably the largest one. My guess is that all three of my co-panelists here would agree with me on that one.
Definitely. Kevin, I'd like to come to you for something that you mentioned earlier around the sourcing and procurement function. Can you just delve a little bit deeper into how that function has become so central to the ESG conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. And actually, I'll pick up on something Virginia and Marc both said, which is, historically, at least in the food business, much of what we bought were commodities. And sort of by definition, what a commodity is you only care about the product attributes. So a bucket of whatever gets delivered to your factory, and everything you care about you can measure in that bucket. The moisture content, the fat content, the color, the flavor, protein, all that kind of stuff. And every bucket that meets your expectations is interchangeable with your expectations. From care in terms of the problem.
I think we lost Kevin. Just while Kevin comes back, Matt, just from your perspective, just to Kevin's points there, how essential do you see the sourcing and procurement function being to the ESG conversation?
I mean, to me, it's the tip of the spear, at least for the footwear industry, because it is exactly where we are manufacturing footwear that it more and more has kind of recycled materials. So we're having this whole conversation about, okay, how does, at least on the environmental side, the E part, how do we create product that is has recycled materials that consumers will want to have access to? That's of interest, and I'll kind of walk down in just a second why there's some pitfalls with that. And then on the production side is how do we do that in a more efficient way? So we actually 3 years ago propped up a shoe waste program. We started out in China. We started with 25 factories feeding retailers and brands like Target and Fila and Steve Madden and other brands. And we just went into the factories and taught them how to recycle their shoe waste and then make a profit off of it, sell it off to recyclers in Guangdong province and Dongguan. And within the first year, we said, hey, look, we think that it'll cost you about $5,000 per factory for us to come in and do this training. We think you'll get that back in the first year, but we'll have to see. And our goal was at the time to get to 25% reduction to landfill and incineration. First year, we got to 40%. The ROI was within a year. So they got back what they invested into the program and then some. And now we're in year 3, where we've gone from 25 factories to about 70 factories. We're in China and Vietnam. And it's been just a small pragmatic thing that we just took for granted. Like, oh, these factories know what to do with their waste and how to recycle it. And the answer to that was no, or they were nervous about doing it without understanding what the ROI was. And so we proved that to them. And then the program now continues to grow, and it's not sexy. It's behind the scenes. It's behind kind of the manufacturing curtain, if you will. But it's pragmatic and it's impactful, and more of our companies are talking about it publicly, particularly our publicly traded companies. Now, on the actual product side, one of our biggest challenges within the industry is that we get lumped in with apparel all the time. And companies like, oh, we figured out sustainability and recycled materials on t-shirts, so footwear should be easy. And footwear and t-shirts are not the same. Newsflash to everybody. Footwear is highly more complex. It requires a lot more inputs and touches and labor to produce it. And to think about like a pair of shoes to be easily recyclable or easily deconstructed and recycled and biodegradable in comparison to doing that with a t-shirt, it's just not the same. And so part of our challenge is to not get lumped in with the apparel guys, because that's a much easier kind of stroll through the sustainability park, if you will. And it's taken some education, expectations from policymakers, like a law in New York that was being bandied around. It was like, oh, t-shirts and shoes, it'll cover everything. And we're like, no, policymakers need to understand, like, these are different industries and different products with different constructions. And so that's just 2 examples of why I think that the sourcing side and the procurement side is the tip of the spear, because it's driving the procurement of the product and it's delivering to the consumer. And it's no easy task to kind of figure out what the best path forward on the sustainability side and within the environmental side of ESG is. But we're trying to, that's why we call it the Wild West. We're trying to do the best we can in kind of the environment we find ourselves before the regulatory hammer comes down and dictates to us how all this should function, whether you can do it or not. So
definitely a great analogy there with the tip of the spear. I saw Marc, you nodding along to that. Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, I think as 2 elements, of course, on the procurement side, I think everybody said it, Kevin said it as well. It is central because you're fundamentally the window on all the materials that come in. I think there's an element that we should change in our mindset. Sustainability and ESG is actually a profit center. And as long as we see this as a cost center, we will be afraid of things. And I think that Matt, with the example that he gave of shoes, although I understand that on t-shirts it's different, but it is an example. And so recyclability, regenerative agriculture, you name it, this is actually a profit center. And as long as you understand that, it could be a profit center because it's a direct profit center. It could be a profit center because your customers are more and more asking for it. And if you look to the big, the Walmarts of the world and all the others that have ESG objectives, but it's also the consumer who is asking more and more for it. And I think Virginia, if I'm correct, alluded to that around transparency and the demand for more and more transparency. I think the one that worries me the most, and if I can, Nick, you said what gap is there the most? For me, the biggest gap is third-party control, independent third-party control, and have enough of that. As the legislation comes on, we will not only have to have our balance sheets, financial balance sheets controlled, but we have a lot of companies there. But what do we do with our social and our G part being controlled by third parties? And I don't see a lot of companies yet in the world that can take on, as Matt was sharing, or as Kevin was sharing, a worldwide supply chain. Because it's not located into one area. And then given, the legal restrictions that Virginia set on disclosing of information. So that's a bit what I wanted to add on your question of gap.
Great. I think the complexity of global supply chains cannot be understated. Kevin, just coming back to you, we were discussing here about the value of the sourcing and procurement function, and Marc mentioned there the transition away from it being a cost center. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, my computer seems to have given up on me. Can you hear me okay through my phone? Terrific. Perfect. Great. So maybe just to finish the story I was telling and then connect to the question you just asked is, so, you know, when all you cared about were product attributes, you know, that was the system we designed procurement for. And so unsurprisingly, we don't have good transparency all the way back to our supply chains, because we weren't trying to design supply chains that had high transparency. That wasn't the objective. And one of the real insights of the whole sustainability space is most of what you care about is not a product attribute. You can't measure for deforestation in the bucket. You can't measure for forced labor. You can't measure for carbon footprint. To understand all those things, and we all understand why we want to understand those things, you need to know something about the process that produced those products. And as soon as you need to understand something about the process, you're not talking about commodities anymore, because this bucket and that bucket are not interchangeable because they came from different places with different processes. And what that pushes you to is the insight that actually you need to rethink your procurement strategy because you've got a different procurement objective. You know, you're not just trying to buy the bucket of stuff that meets all your criteria. You're trying to buy from a supply chain that behaves in certain ways that you are consistent with how the world should work and how you want your business to work. And that needs to be put to procurement functions as a different objective to chase. And then you design supply chains where traceability is not so difficult. You know, you design supply chains that are more cost plus, as Marc suggested for Danone, as opposed to sort of market minus, if you can get away with it, or at least market. And so I think that is, you know, the mistake in procurement in sustainability is adding sustainability criteria to your existing spec and thinking you can't change anything about your procurement strategy. Because in that situation, it will be a cost. The opportunity is to say, I care about these things now, so do I still have the right strategy? And if not, how do I redesign my strategy? And then you start to move into the territory that Marc described of creating value through partnership with your suppliers or the suppliers behind them and more simplified supply chains. And so I think that's really the opportunity, is to, you know, I mean, we have a different problem we're trying to solve for than we've always tried to solve for in the past. And so we need to redesign our approach, and that's where the opportunity comes from.
Definitely. Kevin, just as a follow-up question, obviously Virginia mentioned earlier that the struggles of getting that visibility into tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers. What technologies and strategies are you using to get greater transparency into your whole supplier network?
Yeah, so there of course there is a booming industry of technology platforms, you know, trying to make supply chain transparency easier. You know, but maybe I'll sort of return to the point I made a minute ago, which is I think it is a mistake to assume that the answer to transparency and traceability is make your current supply chain transparent and traceable. I think the first question should be, do I have a supply chain that is transparent and traceable? And if not, maybe I need to redesign my supply chain. So, for example, when we started working on palm oil, you know, we mapped our supply chain, and based on the export terminals and the places we were sourcing from, you know, we had potentially 1,500 mills in our palm oil supply chain. That's something like a third of the mills on the planet. You know, we buy sort of 0.1%, give or take, of global palm oil. So we're exposed to 1/500th or 1/1000th of the palm oil out there we needed, and we were exposed to a third of the supply chain. And so we were never going to be able to do a really quality job on transparency and traceability because of the breadth of how many little fingers were at the end of that distribution sort of coming towards us. And so that's why we've proceeded down the pathway of designing a much simpler supply chain where we have more bandwidth and can invest more capacity in not only knowing what's going on, but making sure the right things are happening and creating the right sort of incentives and motivations to drive the outcomes that we're hoping for. And so I think, you know, the number one answer to how do you get better transparency and traceability in your supply chains is probably first, do you have a supply chain that you can make transparent and traceable? It's not starting with a technology solution, it's starting with a design of the problem you're trying to solve.
Excellent. Yeah, really appreciate that, Kevin. Matt, just from your perspective, obviously Kevin gave some really good examples there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I thought that critical thought from Kevin was spot on, because everyone's just trying to layer the technology on top of the current supply chain. The supply chains are, in a lot of industries, are just very, very difficult to move, or you maybe don't have the leverage that Mars has on the palm oil example that Kevin gave. But so many people are just trying to do the visibility in their supply chain as it's currently constructed. And so Kevin coming here and saying, flipping the script, I think is really critical, because I think, it was interesting. We had a hearing, just using this for Uyghur forced labor again. We had a virtual hearing where many people testified to the U.S. government about whether or not we could implement, and as good citizens within the U.S. trade community, could we implement and adhere to the provisions that Virginia talked about within the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in good faith, because we're good companies. We're not terrible companies. We're not terrible people. We want to do what's right. But we also operate in countries, as Virginia said, that make it against the law to actually to participate with us. So it's just this weird environment we find ourselves in. And I've been in the U.S. government. I've worked on Capitol Hill. I've been in a presidential administration. I've testified 100 times. I've never been as a part of a hearing where you had all these technology companies basically just selling their products as their testimony to either the U.S. government to give it a seal of approval, or to companies to adhere to it or adopt it. And that's what the environment we're in. Kevin talked about it, this exploding kind of landscape of tech companies that say they can get to every nook and cranny within your supply chain with direct visibility. And I can just tell you, if you're like a mom and pop importer that supplies a big mass, if you're bringing in footwear for a big mass retailer, and you're a family owned importer in New York City, and you wear 3 hats, one of the things that is really hard for our employees to ascertain is, which way do I go? What technology? I don't have time to test out this technology. This is a huge investment. We don't have the budget for that. So it is just, there's a lot of unstoppable forces, meaning immovable objects right now in this space. And it's really difficult for our employees to kind of know what's what. And so Kevin's kind of step back, think about what your supply chain currently is, and do you have to kind of reconfigure it so that you can actually make it visible? And that's, I think, a question worth asking.
Excellent. I think there's a lot of great points there to the nuance of the technology conversation. Virginia, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. But first of all, I think Kevin's point is also spot on. And what's interesting about it is this is going to vary a lot depending on your industry. But if you are, for example, a manufacturer, you may already have a lot of this information or be using technology, whether it's actually in your ERP or from a global trade point of view. For example, for years, there's been software out there on the market that is using this type of technology to assess whether goods are eligible for free trade agreement eligibility, which basically does the same kind of breaking down and mapping a finished good into multiple components and assigns things like tariff numbers and countries of origins and that kind of stuff. Now, it's not being used for the same sort of thing, but it could be sort of repurposed and as it be sort of a starting point from looking at a finished good and mapping it back, because it has to assign some certain basic data elements. So it's the kind of a way of what happens whenever something new like this comes along is importers, exporters, whatever area of global trade you're in, they really have to sort of think outside of the box. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of the best companies are really doing is trying to sort of expand how they're solving for these problems. But then beyond that, if you I won't say if, when you've tried to solve for that and are able to figure out how to map your supply chain the way you really are going to have to be able to, as Kevin pointed out. There absolutely are tools out there, and I fully agree with what both Matt and Kevin have pointed out, which is that the market is just booming in terms of options out there. So you do want to be careful in sitting down and assessing the features, the pros, the cons, what you really need as a company, because there may be way too many bells and whistles for what you actually need in your particular need, or maybe you need all those bells and whistles, but you want to be looking at probably a minimum of 3 basic things. You've got to screen entities. I mean, you should be screening entities anyway, but you've got to make sure that you can screen against denied lists, and not just the basic ones, the ones that you'd be screening against, for example, as an exporter. But for example, can you screen against the parties that are going to be on the WRO list that CBP is issuing as part of forced labor, things like that. So that sort of basic functionality. But then also, excuse me, basic things like the ability to trigger questionnaires. Now, that's a pretty basic functionality that a lot of these tools are going to be offering. That's where you start to get into different feature functionality, because some of them will just have, well, there's a questionnaire and there's yes or no answers, and you have to have a lot more than that. In fact, CBP's risk analysis guidelines say as much. They're like, it has to be more than yes or no. You have to have the ability for text. You have to have the ability to have pictures uploaded. You have to have the ability for corrective actions that you trigger based on what the responses are. So you really have to be able to dig deep when you're having this conversation far back with the, not just tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, et cetera. And so that you can really follow up and understand what's going on. And then probably the final piece to this, and this is really always the same, I would say, when it comes to global trade management solutions, is the content piece. Because a big part of what you need to do to assess your risk in this area is looking at the region, the area, and the commodities, because those two pieces together really drive your risk. And when you're trying to assess, can I even stay in this area? Because it was interesting what you were saying, Matt, about being in the room in these hearings, and all of the technology providers, basically one big advertisement. One of the other things that I was struck with in the conversations with CBP that I've never heard in all my years in the trade is their response to the trade's "we can't do this," which the trade has said on a lot of proposed regulations in the past. It's been very much, then you're just going to have to decide what the risk is. End of conversation. Which is kind of different than we've heard in past regulations. And so this is very much something that companies are going to have to assess for themselves, what their risk is.
I agree with you, Virginia. I think it was unique. I've never heard it said as such. And I think, having been on the interagency side myself, it was a realization that the enforcement mechanism of the U.S. government was like, we have a short timetable and the law is really in a strict way written. There's no wiggle room. So it is what it is. We're just going to serve it up to you. We're going to do our best on enforcement. And here's the first list on the WRO side, as you mentioned, and off we go. And I, even kind of anecdotally speaking behind the scenes with some of the agency reps, they felt like their hands were tied. And so I think we're going to continue to have more and more of policymakers setting standards, not fully understanding how procurement works, not fully understanding supply chains, and dictating them, whether it's at the SEC, so it's a regulatory it's a regulatory action, or it's with the U.S. Congress, where it's a legislative action, and the experts, those on this call and many others, are going to have to figure out how to make it work, in spite of the fact that expectations may be inappropriately set. That's just the nature of policymaking, as we all know. But I agree with you. These are different times for sure, and it's just going to continue to increase in, I think, frequency and burden, to be honest with you.
Excellent. Marc, I'd love to hear your perspective before we switch gears on this. What's your perspective on, I guess, the strategies and technologies that can be used to drive that greater transparency in light of what Matt, Virginia, and Kevin have been talking about?
Well, first, a little reflection on what Kevin and Virginia were talking about. I think as a large organization, we have to be very careful when we choose our tool. Because what I very often see is that we as an organization choose a tool then let's say Virginia's organization chooses a tool, Matt's organization chooses a tool, but we all go to the same supplier. And now all of a sudden that supplier needs to fill in 25 tools. And I think that that is one of the elements where we have to be very, very, very careful of, because I think that Matt early in the beginning said from time to time it's the Wild West, right? Every tool is hope and glory that is being connected. So to address that topic, I think as an organization, we tend to go back to the very old way, which is bring the supply chain together. Bring, in our case, your farmer community together once a year, and then have that exchange before you decide to do something. And of course, with COVID, that became a bit more complicated, but we'll bring it back now, now that we are out of this. But I think that interacting with your supply chain, understand what already exists within there, even including the tools, to avoid that you're going to impose another thing. And a little bit like Kevin said, you don't change anything on your supply chain, you just impose another KPI, is not going to make it work. So I would encourage all of us to be very, very mindful when we choose all these technologies, that it's not going to be another burden coming on the whole supply world. So that would be my recommendation on this one.
Definitely think so. Marc.
Yeah, if I could maybe jump in, I mean, maybe another thought here that I think is important is you know, it would be great if everyone used the same tool, but that's not going to happen. Right? You know, we don't all speak the same language around the world. We use different currencies. You have to carry plug adapters when you travel, and so I think that's, you know, it's great. We should aspire for it. We should push for it. But I think and almost a more important priority is interoperability of all those systems. Right? So, you know, I started out this Zoom call dialed in from my Windows PC. You know, my network crashed, and I jumped over to my iPhone, which is running iOS, and Zoom doesn't care. Right? Because, you know, there's a protocol that says this is how you connect. And so I think that's something we need to think very hard about, is making sure, because different tools will make sense for different reasons. And so, but I think really driving this interoperability and sort of standardization of what information flows from one level to the other of the supply chain is the most important question. And then to the extent you can have 7 tools instead of 700 tools doing it, that's probably good. But that interoperability is almost more important.
Excellent. Virginia, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I did. I was going to say something sort of similar to what you said, Kevin, and going beyond that, the ability to move data around very quickly, whether it's via APIs or whatever, so that when you're looking at a tool, if it makes sense for your supplier base to be sending data electronically, so that they don't have to necessarily go and log into, you know, a million different tools to meet their million different customers' needs, and they can send it electronically from their systems. That's a great feature to be looking for. But there are also times that there are providers out there that actually can work with, for example, an association, and come up with a version of their tool that all of their partner companies, their membership companies, can have the same version of together. And so that sometimes can be an option that can help in this way.
Definitely. Matt, obviously a key theme of this webinar has been the fast changing laws and keeping up. Just from your perspective, what advice would you give to some of the executives listening to this on how they can keep up with these fast changing laws?
Great question. As a trade association exec, I would be remiss if I didn't say plug into your dominant trade association within your product category or your business vertical, whatever that might be, and stay in touch, because if operating properly and functioning properly, that association should be scouring the planet for what's coming. So for example, when we started to see that in the European market, market might, to the municipality, to the city level, dictate who owns waste, whether it's the brand itself or the consumer itself, and then apply taxes or other kind of fees to the brand for Johnny Consumer in a town in France, what he might do with his pair of ABC footwear kicks or whatever at the end of their life. If that brand needs to still own that and is liable for it, how do they navigate that? So we create a whole section within our website for our members to navigate, we call them shoe sustainability briefs, just on the sustainability side, just so that they can navigate each of the markets globally as to what the risks are and what's currently happening. And then we update them in real time. We also, in that, have a ton of working groups on a lot of different issues. And the working group on sustainability is very active for us. And so we spend a lot of time communicating, connecting with our members, giving them a heads up, and then advocating on their behalf to the whole point on the apparel versus footwear. We're having a very public kind of campaign to educate policymakers that apparel and footwear are not the same thing when you're making these laws, so don't treat them as such. And so for me, it's really being plugged into your trade association. If you have a outside counsel or internal counsel, and making sure they're focused on this. This is the next frontier of kind of the regulatory side of things, right? If it's tax policy and tariff policy and trade policy in the 20th century, the 21st century is still all those things, but you're attaching onto it the environmental, the social, and the governance as it relates to how do you report as a public company, and where do you source your product from? Do you have line of sight into it based on who's making it, et cetera, et cetera? All the things we talked about now. You have to have a team of people who are really focused on this to make sure that you don't step in it. And that's easier said than done, but that would be my advice for folks who are listening in.
Thanks for that, Matt. Kevin, just from your perspective, obviously we've discussed a lot of things on today's webinar, and it would seem kind of glaringly obvious that the companies should be investing in ESG initiatives, but despite that, there's maybe a lack of uptake, or not as much uptake as some people would like. From your perspective, how do companies win buy-in on ESG initiatives? If you could unmute, Kevin.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's a great question. I think I think you can get a little ways down the road. It's a little bit like the procurement thing, right? You can get a little ways down the road without sort of a management team, board, ownership level decision. There's some things you can do, but I think fundamentally to really get to where we need to get to, you need that top level alignment around what is the nature of our business, and how do we want to run our business, that you've heard some examples of here. And I think, what you really need is a leadership team and an ownership and a management structure that is not only trying to solve for how do I make my business thrive today, but how do I set my business up to thrive for generations. The name of our sustainability plan is Sustainable in a Generation. There's lots of meanings to that. One is that it will take a generation to get to the end points on some of these, right? We can make continuous improvement in a few years, but we're not going to get to where we really want to be in 3 years on any of these issues. The other is, of course, that we're thinking about future generations, but almost more importantly is that we want our businesses to thrive for generations. And so I think you need that alignment around planning, not just for short-term success, but long-term success. Because Marc's, comments about sustainability being a profit center, notwithstanding, I think in time, as consumers more broadly reward this, and as policymakers hopefully start, regulating out some of the bad behaviors, I think that will be true. But there may well be a period in the middle here where this is about what's the smartest way you can find to internalize all these externality costs that we always talk about, and set yourself up for success in the future. So yeah, I think it's really important of getting that sort of senior level engagement and buy-in, and having the right discussion of, some of these changes are not nudges to maybe draw an analogy to Matt. This isn't changing the color of the shoelaces, right? This is a completely different shoe. And so I think that's really important to land with people, because I think that then unlocks the potential and the power and the creativity of all the people that work in all these businesses to really solve the right problem, and not just be yet another constraint on what's probably already an over-constrained problem.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Kevin. Marc, I'd love to hear your perspectives just to Kevin's points there.
Yeah, totally aligned with Kevin. And I would like to add one thing to that, which we do very often, is integrate ESG in the brand and the brand communication. because we should not underestimate that there is a very important consumer interest in towards all these type of things. And so when I was sharing with, around making it a profit center, whatever you do from the beginning to the start to the consumer, bringing that to a brand, making sure that brand stands for something, has showed, at least for the Danone Group, some real added value. And I think that is one of the elements that we are talking about. I think the other element that is not only does it bring value on the consumer side, but it also brings massive value on the employees that you have, because you see all of a sudden a real engagement. I'm doing something not because someone told me, but I can go to the supermarket and I see that there's communication around it. And I can tell you that has created in the entire supply chain, but also towards the employees, an enormous amount of pride, and which then helps in retention and all the other type of things, and also on attracting, I would say, even better talent. So it's a journey, and there's most probably not one solution that fits all, but I could not agree more than what Kevin said is, if it is not integrated at the top, it's another burden that comes on top of everybody.
Excellent. Before we wrap up, Matt, I'd love to hear your perspective on this too.
Yeah, this one's hitting close to home for us because we did a survey last year of our footwear workforce and said, hey, we asked them a bunch of questions on sustainability. And we said, hey, are you equipped technologically or technically equipped? Do you have the knowledge base to accomplish what our brands will say or are saying they're going to accomplish on sustainability? Meaning whatever the claim is on reducing carbon footprint or using more recycled materials or reconfiguring your headquarters to be LEED certified or whatever it is. Are you equipped to do that? 70% said no. And so for us as an association, we see that and we're like, oh my gosh. So we created an e-learning center for our members, employees, that allow them to do really technical on-demand deep dives on production, materials, sourcing, all the things that go into it so that we could help fill that gap and equip them. And we're about to put the survey back out in the marketplace this week. I'm very curious to see if that number's come down at all, because that's what we see ourselves as a trade association. How do we collectively leverage the industry to drive change in a positive way? And a part of it is that it'll be great to attract talent. It's also really great if you're investing in your current workforce so that they're equipped to do what you claim you're going to do with your brand, at least in the footwear space. And if you're not doing that, you're just saying things and then pushing people off to just add to Marc's point, just a layer on top current job descriptions and to-dos, you're not going to be successful, right? So you need to be making those investments in either attracting new talent or carving out new pathways for your current talent to be educated, informed, and equipped to go out and accomplish what your brand is saying that they will accomplish and the commitments that they're making to their consumers.
Excellent. Thanks for those points, Matt. As we wrap up today, I'd like to ask each panelist, in light of today's conversation, what excites you about the future of the procurement and sourcing function? Starting off with Kevin with that one.
Yeah, I think the exciting thing for the procurement function is that there's a whole new set of design criteria you're trying to solve around, right? And so this is two things. One, I think this will elevate the importance of procurement, right? And so I think this will push more procurement people into, at the very least, more strategic discussions, if not actual more senior positions in companies. And so I think this is a super exciting trend if you're in that as a professional field. And I think also just there's a real intellectual opportunity to work on more interesting problems that matter to the world. And I think that's hugely engaging and empowering for people in the field.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Kevin. And Marc, just from your perspective, what excites you about the future of this function?
Exactly what Kevin said. I couldn't say it better. I think that it's a great opportunity for the professionals, first of all, to think full business, because a solution that stands on its own will not be a solution that survives. I think it will question the exact position of procurement in organizations. I think very often procurement has been positioned, and I'm not talking about Danone, but very often procurement has been positioned as an add-on on the industrial tool. And I think that will be challenged in the future as we move on. And I think it will attract a different profile of buyers as well. So I am extremely excited about it, and therefore don't see it as a burden, but much more as an opportunity to do better.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Marc. And same question to you, Matt. What excites you about the future of this function?
You know, the last few years have been really challenging to the folks managing our supply chain. If you think about the agility required when you add 4 or 5 once in a generation variables on top, like pandemic and war and inflation, and just the supply chain has been whipsawed back and forth. I'm just been in awe of the professionals that we serve and what they've had to do behind the scenes to be agile, to drive product, to find product when consumers demand it, to do it in a thoughtful way, and then to kind of layer on top. My hope is that we kind of get out of the immediacy of the challenges we find ourselves in right now, which is the pandemic and inventory management and the whipsaw that we've been in. And we start to think more longer term about what opportunities are ahead of us so that we can, it's so hard, I think, for sourcing folks to not be thinking about that day or the next week and where they're going to find product or what are they going to do with the product no one's buying right now because the bottom's dropped out in consumer behavior. And so my hope is that we have an environment where we're educating our employees, where we're empowering them, and we're creating that intellectual outlet Kevin talked about, because I think that's important, that something bigger than ourselves, we're working on something bigger than ourselves, and we can actually accomplish it. We're not just kind of spitballing and acting like we can do these things. At the same time, helping them navigate these really challenging times we've been in. So I'm optimistic because I know the people and I know how hard they work and I know how agile they are. And I think if those people who can find solutions to how do you meet the retail apocalypse during pandemic, and then how do you get product in when it's sitting for months on end in the harbor, how do you do all these things? Those are the same people that are going to be entrusted with the hard work that is kind of the movement of goods and ESG and sustainability, and they're innovative people and agile people. And I think all of this, what we've been through in the last few years, I should say, has really equipped our folks and empower them to really drive good change. And I think that's why I'm optimistic, because I know who's at the wheel, and I'm very grateful that those people are at the wheel. And we'll see what happens, right? There's many pitfalls ahead, but we have a good industry, at least from the footwear perspective. I'm excited about that. Excellent.
Thanks for that, Matt. And last but not least, Virginia, same question to you. What excites you about the future of this function?
Well, I think that what we've seen over the last few years is that there are some really new and kind of different challenges that procurement has seen. And so what I'm excited about is that I'm definitely not all doom and gloom, kind of like what Matt was saying about our future and being able to solve for them. And what I think are going to be some of the keys to solving for these challenges is bringing together a combination of data and automation and really good creative thinking skills. And that sort of combination of skill set in people are going to be some of the people that are going to really shine in procurement. And so I think that's going to be some people that are already in the field, and it's going to bring a lot of new people into procurement. And I think that's going to be really healthy for the field. And so as I look to the future of procurement, I think that combination of people who have been in the field and new people in the field will make for a really exciting future for the field.
Excellent. Thanks for that. This has been a very, very fascinating conversation. The hour's gone by very, very quickly. I think we need to get everyone back for a part 2 in 6 months, because the challenges are unending and we need a part 2. But thanks a lot to all the panelists today for taking the time out of their busy schedules. And I hope to see you very soon on another Reuters Events webinar.
Thanks.